Today we have the honor and pleasure of welcoming Kathleen Eisenhardt, who's going to talk about simple rules in a complex world. And Kathy is a wonderful scholar, deeply engaged in practice, really wonderful insights. And I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say, Kathy. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay. All right, so I will get started. Let's see. Share screen. All right, first of all, thank you, SMS, for having me. And thank you all for spending an hour with me. And good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. But thanks a lot for listening. This, what for me is this morning. What I'm going to be talking about is some work that I've done over the years, both in Harvard Business Review, but also in ASQ. So sort of spanning the spectrum of from the theory world to the practice world on simple rules. And in particular, a book that I did with Don Sull, who's at MIT. So I do want to have a shout out to Don. So what I'm going to be talking about today is simple rules, how to thrive in a complex world. I'm going to start out with a vignette about a sergeant who was in the US Army. He's a medic. He was in Iraq near Mosul, at a base near Mosul. It was Christmas time. And he was in the line to get his dessert. And as he was picking up his cheesecake, there was suddenly an explosion. As he called it afterwards, it was the boom of all booms. In the wake of that explosion, he's a medic. What does he do? Chaos, bodies everywhere, injured people. What do you do? And what he did was fall back on the simple rules of triage. Give palliative care to the people who won't make it, the people who will make it on their own, let them make it on their own, and focus your attention on the people who you can actually save, where you're stepping in is actually going to make a difference. And then there are a couple of simple rules that medics use to figure out who those people are. For example, things around blood pressure and looking at their eyes. So what's the point? The point is that in a chaotic world, it often makes sense to step back and be simple. And not that business is wartime, but business certainly has some complexity to it. So what I'm going to argue today is that people and things ranging from Janet Yellen, now our US Secretary of the Treasury, crickets, and Mark Zuckerberg all cope with complexity. Janet Yellen in the US economy and the global economy, having very simple rules around inflation, for example. Mark Zuckerberg, complex organization, simple rules to manage that organization. You're probably wondering what crickets are doing there. Well, crickets have a simple world, but they have a very small brain, and so it looks complicated to them. And so the point is, for whether you're a cricket or you're Janet Yellen, in a complex world, keep it simple. What are simple rules? Simple rules are shortcuts that save time and effort by focusing your attention and simplifying how you think. So simplifying the world. A couple of features of simple rules. Let me sort of simple rules 1.0. Simple rules are simple. That means there aren't a lot of them. That means there may be 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, but relatively small number of rules. Rules depend on the person and the situation. So Will's rules are not my rules, for example. And simple rules relate to a repeated activity. They're not platitudes like be nice to your customer, but they're about a repeated activity. Let me dive in and make that a little bit more concrete. And talk about the simple rules of eating. Michael Pollan, if you don't know Michael Pollan, is an author as well as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He wrote The Botany of Desire as one of his main books, but he's written a number of popular books. Many people have Michael Pollan's rules for eating on the refrigerator. What are Michael Pollan's rules? Eat only things your grandmother would recognize. Eat not too much. Eat mostly plants. So the rule about what would your grandmother recognize is basically saying no processed foods, so natural foods. So those are Michael Pollan's 3 rules. What your grandmother would recognize, not too much, mostly plants. So simple rules are simple. But let's contrast the simple rules of eating of Michael Pollan with the simple rules of the Stanford football team, or American football for our international friends. The simple rules of eating are different for 20, 21-year-old young men who are very athletic. And so the simple rules of the Stanford football team are eat breakfast, because college-age students, as we all know, sleep in and then rush to class, but it's important to eat breakfast. The second rule is stay hydrated. These are active people and they need to stay hydrated. The third rule is eat all you want, as long as you can pick it, pluck it, or kill it. So if you think about what is that saying, it's saying, first of all, those are different rules than Michael Pollan would have. So for example, middle-aged Michael Pollan does not need a rule that says eat all you want. That's not a good idea. But on the other hand, there are also some similarities. For example, eating only what your grandmother would recognize is kind of the same as pick it, pluck it, or kill it, in the sense that it's about natural foods. So the second point is simple rules depend on the person, depend on the situation. Finally, simple rules refer to a repeated activity. So a repeated activity would be choosing foods, what do you eat every day, or I'm going to talk about picking crowdfunded projects. What simple rules do not refer to is things that you kind of one-off things. So for example, there are not simple rules for getting married. Presumably you get married once or maybe twice or maybe 3 times, but you don't repeatedly do it. In contrast, choosing your diet, hiring people, forming alliances are things that you do repeatedly. To give you an example, picking crowdfunded projects, comparing Indiegogo versus Kickstarter, 2 platforms where you can get projects funded. Despite the fact that what they're doing is the same thing, picking crowdfunded projects to be on their platforms, their rules are actually, however, distinct. Kickstarter came from a background of arts curation, and so it's very much a curation mindset and an artistic appreciation. So what Kickstarter does is has 12 categories, and you have to fit into one of their categories. If you don't fit into a category, you are not on the platform, and then you have to have certain aesthetics as well. By contrast, Indiegogo is a crowdfunding platform here in California from Berkeley, actually University of California, Berkeley grads. And that's a platform where anything goes. As long as it's legal, you can put whatever you want on the Indiegogo platform. You can fund what would have been your European vacation, your dental surgery, whatever you want, you can put on there. So the point is 2 different sets of rules for what is the same activity for 2 competitive platforms. Interesting on both of these is they're really reflecting, the rules are reflecting the values of the founders. One an arts curation background, the other more of the anything goes People's Republic of Berkeley. Okay, that's kind of the background of what simple rules are. Let's step back for a minute and think about, why do simple rules work? And simple rules, by the way, are one of those things that are fairly fractal. Simple rules can work with your kids or your spouse or your business or whatever. That's a fairly fractal concept. But why do they work? They work because they're flexible opportunity capture. So in the business context, you're balancing some rules that are giving you some sort of efficiency and repeatability, but you're also having some flexibility. So to go back to Michael Pollan's food rules, eat mostly plants. That means when you're having lunch, you can have kale, you can have blueberries, you can have cabbage, but mostly emphasize the vegetables and fruits. So the idea is you have some degree of efficiency around the simplicity, around the continuity of the rules, but you also have flexibility. And what I've seen in working with companies and in research, that's actually the way companies scale fast, is they have a relatively small number of rules and they scale on those rules. Why else do simple rules work? Simple rules work because you make better decisions. They focus you on what really matters. They can be a proxy for lots of different information correlated together. So for example, one company I worked with had a geographic expansion rule of go to former British colonies or the Commonwealth. That was a proxy for a whole lot of cultural traits, the English language, usually higher GDP, better internet penetration. So it was a proxy for a lot of different rules summed up in one rule. It's also, I think, perhaps the most important part of simple rules for decisions is that they're simple and you can do them when you're busy, when you're stressed, when you're tired, when you're overloaded, when you've got way too much going on. It's, oh, I just have to remember 3 things. I don't have to remember a whole rule book. And then finally, better coordination. This is obviously important in bigger companies, coordinating across businesses, across continents, across offices, whatever. But because they're simple to communicate and remember, it's easier to coordinate. Okay, that's a little bit of the background. Let me now drill down a little bit and talk about some companies. One company that I think used simple rules particularly interestingly was Google. This is a picture of the Google campus. Google campus has these googly bikes there. That's kind of a classic feature. One of the problems that Google ran into and continues to run into is being able to hire people, being able to hire enough people to keep up with their growth, and in particular, hire people who are computer scientists. So how do you do that? Well, one of the strategies of Google was simple rules. And the idea was, first of all, we'll choose people from certain schools and with certain GPAs. So sort of classic job market characteristics. Did they go to a great computer science department school? Did they have great grades? But beyond that, that sort of gets rid of some of your applicants. But how do you really hone in who you want? Well, what Google also looked for was somebody who was doing something eccentric, somebody who was a juggler, somebody who'd spent a year in Tibet, somebody who had been a stay-at-home father, something that was different. So something that showed potentially more creativity. So looking for an eccentric person, also looking for people who were referred to Google by other Googlers. Here the idea was Googlers know what good Googlers look like and they want more good Googlers. And so referrals played a big role. And then finally, they also avoided hiring people who had even a touch of exaggeration in their resume. But because here, what Google wanted to do was really have a high ethical standard. So no fudging on your resume, you're gone no matter how good you are. So that helped Google really sort through thousands of applications to get the right, if you will, Googlers. Let me give you another example. This is Airbnb. Airbnb, if you think about it, has a problem or maybe an opportunity because there's so many different places that you can stay at Airbnb. So for example, you can stay in an igloo, you can stay in a treehouse, you can stay in an Italian villa, a castle, or just an ordinary apartment like many of us have. So there's this wide range of accommodations, but yet you're host to the core of your business. So how do you manage hosts who are in all different parts of the world with all different kinds of accommodations? And here, it's somewhat changed because of legal things, but certainly at the outset, they had a few simple rules for hosts. For example, and by the way, and you'll see, I think also that these rules are fairly strategic. One of the rules was, which they learned in New York actually, was have professional photos of the property taken. So whether it's a treehouse or an Italian villa, have professional photos of it. What that did from a strategic point of view was, first of all, it gave potential renters a good idea of what the space looked like, but also differentiated from Craigslist, which at the time, has been a competitor. So differentiated was more upmarket than Craigslist. The second thing they did was instruct their hosts to always have local touches. So you might be in, Paris is a big Airbnb city. You would have your free pass to the Louvre. You'd have the subway map. You'd have directions to the farmer's market. Something that was very local about how a person could engage in your city or your town or your rural area. But the rule itself was simple. Have some local activities that your guests can enjoy. What that did was actually differentiate from hotels, because a concierge at a hotel is a much more formal, much more upscale. This is more about, here's my subway pass. Finally, a third rule, which I thought was pretty interesting rule, was always have clean soap. Now, why clean soap? Because most people get the obvious, like vacuum and dust and put away the dirty dishes. But what people often forget is a small touch, like clean soap in the bathroom. And yet for a guest, fresh soap is just, used soap is sort of, ugh. Fresh soap, oh yeah, this is a clean place. So it sort of signaled very simply with something that was easy for hosts to forget. This is a clean place I want to stay. So again, the point is a small number of rules managing a wide variety of encounters, and then letting hosts then have their own individuality. Final example of simple rules. It's a company I'm going to call Consumer Co., but it's a company that does consumer electronics. So things like phones and drones and Nest products and that sort of thing. Consumer electronics that typically will have a number of different moving parts with them and a number of different technologies. This was a company that over time started out doing lots of different experimentation and then realized how to actually turn that into simple rules on repeated products. And so what this company started doing was, in every new product, whatever it was, the engineering team would pick out what are the critical components. And for each critical component, we're going to have competing teams. 2 competing teams on each component, got to be the rules, 2 competing teams, between 3 and 8 team members on the team, so not too big. And then the teams could do 3 prototypes, prototype, prototype, prototype. At the end of that 3rd or sometimes 4th prototype, there would be a winning team. The winning team would go on, and the losing team would get broken up and go back into the pool for the next product. So what that became was a way to develop a variety of different kinds of components, using something of a formula, but also something of flexibility of exactly who was on a particular team, exactly what the product was. And so again, the point is this idea of a small number of rules giving you flexibility, allowing you to make decisions when you're stressed out and busy, and a way that you can actually spread it out throughout the corporation. So for example, this is a company that has several thousand employees, and across their different sites having very similar rules, and presumably updating those rules at times. Okay, so let's go to Simple Rules 4.0. Where do they come from? Well, they come from your own reflection, looking back on your own experience and trying to understand a process, whether it's partnering or acquisition or hiring or whatever the process is that you're looking at, or working with your 5-year-old. But whatever the process is, thinking back on your own successes and failures. Another way that's become common for finding simple rules is experimentation. So that's become popular, different ways. A/B testing is the classic one, but also other forms of experimentation. Or sometimes the rules come from personal values. I mentioned the Indiegogo Kickstarter contrast, that was about personal values. eBay is another example of a company that used personal values. For example, the eBay platform has a prohibition against guns. And the idea there is that eBay is trying to emulate a flea market or a neighborhood where it's a group of friends, and that guns were something they simply didn't want on their platform. So it comes from your own experience. Also can come from others, from analogy, from imitation, from reading a book, from the advice of friends and colleagues, or more recently coming from things like big data and machine learning. Machine learning is essentially produces, if you cut off at the first several factors, is actually a bunch of simple rules. And so increasingly, particularly in the medical area, people are using machine learning to come up with simple rules. For example, simple rules for diagnosing cancer or autism, for example. Let me give you some examples and bring it down to the more concrete. This was a company that we worked with. That was a catering company. It's a Central European country, and their business is working with Western companies who have offices in Central Europe, and creating and running their cafeterias. And they cater to companies that are interested in high quality food for their employees. So again, to go back to Google, Google's a classic example of a company that does that. But there are a number of other companies as well that are interested in that. So this is a company that runs cafeterias in-house at various company sites within Central Europe. What happened with this company was the chefs at each cafeteria were choosing their menus. And as you might imagine, the chefs were enjoying the flexibility and freedom of being creative and ordering whatever they wanted, and whether it was in season or not, and sort of creating. It turns out that actually doesn't work real well for the company, though, because it's expensive. And so what Zizzy did was get together some of their chefs and start sort of introduce them to the reality we actually have to make profit, and worked with them to figure out what could be a way for them to still be creative and individual, but also so that there was some repeatability across the cafes so that they could make money. And so what they decided to do, the chefs and the company as well, but largely driven by the chefs, was first of all first rule was you have to fix the menu on Wednesday for the following week. So Wednesday at noon, we set the menus for the 5 days of the next week. Second thing is 3 of the 5 dishes have to be our best sellers. So you can experiment some, but you always have to sell 3 of the 5 best sellers. You have to offer those. Third rule was 2 of the dishes have to be the same across all the cafeterias. So there's got to be some commonality across the cafeterias. And then finally, 90% of the fruits and vegetables have to be in season or locally grown. Again, that was partly because the taste value of locally grown and fresh ingredients, and partly is because of the because it's actually less expensive than, for example, importing oranges when it's completely the off time of year. So what happened at Zizzy was after a fairly short period of time, probably about 6-8 months, they had 140% increase in revenue. They doubled their profits, and then over a two-year period, they were actually increasing the number of cafes by tripling it. So overall, the point was they sort of went from an unprofitable business or a marginally profitable business to a business that that was able to grow and be profitable. Give you another example of finding the rules, creating the rules. This is a company that does dental alignment products. You know, braces, only better looking perhaps than braces, and we're going to call it Pioneer Dental. And this was looking not at their cafe menu process, but at their sales process. What they were doing was they had a sales force, a direct sales force that was calling on dentists to buy the product, and they were striking out a lot at the time. And so the problem was, how do we make the calls for our salespeople more likely to result in a sale? So what they did was got together some of their salespeople and the team and started brainstorming, who is the ideal dentist? Like, who is that? And they came up with about 9 criteria of who the ideal dentist was. For example, the ideal dentist owns his or her own practice, or the ideal dentist is in an age range between 35 and 55. Under 35, they aren't established yet. Over 55, although some of us who are older might not appreciate this, may not be into doing new things. So they had these rules. They then had 3 teams go back through their data of who had actually bought the product, how it worked, and started checking those rules and who the ideal dentist was, with who really was the ideal dentist, and whether these rules worked. What they found after a couple of weeks was they found that some of these rules were effective, but some of them you really couldn't even use. So it was very hard to tell how old a dentist was, for example. It was also very hard to tell who owned their own practice. It was sort of obscure because these are often private companies. So they couldn't really tell. So those rules might have been great, but they couldn't get the data. But what they did find were particularly effective rules. They started trying to find what were some good rules. One was the quality of the dentist website. A dentist that has a forward-looking website is typically a better likely customer. The other one was looking at finance charges, because you can get data on finance charges. Dentists who had less than 3 finance charges in a year were also good candidates. And so what they did was revamp the rules, and in about 18 months had a 42% increase in sales, and they quadrupled the productivity of their sales force. So by being more thoughtful about who we're calling on, and then calling on those people, they were able to come up with better performance. I'm going to say a little bit about simple rules and strategy, because simple rules, as I mentioned before, are fractal. You can use them with your 5-year-old, you can use them with your corporation. But there are a couple things about strategy that I want to say directly. First of all, the rules that people start with are usually not that great. But how you get them better is sort of blindingly obvious. And it's meeting and thinking about them, and are they working and are they not? The other way to make them better is adding the rules that are hard to learn. Rules about timing and rules about stopping. Because people are very good at rules about picking to do things, like which stock to pick, which company to call on. But they're not so good at rules about time, how often to do something, or when to stop doing something. For example, when to sell a stock, when to end an alliance relationship. Second thing is, in terms of strategy, is sometimes people win with better rules. It's not just that you're differentiated, which was the case of Indiegogo and Kickstarter, where they both do reasonably well, but they're differentiated. This was actually sometimes there are reasons why you compete better with rules. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about revolutionary. And then I'm going to open it up to you all. So just quickly, I've said a bit about improving rules. We can get to that more at Q&A. But competing on the rules, this is actually a double slide meaning. If you recognize the guy with the flag, that's Roald Amundsen. And he was in a race with Robert Scott of the UK. Amundsen is from Norway, to get to the South Pole in the beginning of the 1900s. And they competed on fundamentally different rules, primarily around Roald was doing dog sleds and Scott was doing man hauling. More contemporary example is Uber versus Lyft. Again, that's a story where Uber had better rules than Lyft in terms of entering new cities and knowing which cities to enter and how to enter them, and was able to move past. Lyft was actually the first entrant in that market, in the rideshare market, and moved past Uber. But the place I really want to spend time is to talk about this example, really a revolutionary example of breaking the rules. Many of you probably watch television. You may watch it in the States or Canada or wherever you are, and you may or may not know Cheers. But Cheers was a television show that ran in the States for 11 years, 11 seasons, and 40 million people watched the end show of Cheers. So it was a massively popular hit, but yet it was following what became the industry rules. Rules have a stable cast of quirky people. So some of you may remember the bartender Sam, and then there was the postman who was kind of talked too much, and there was the everyman overweight guy, or was Norma the waitress, and so on. So it was an ensemble cast of people with quirky personalities. And the writers of Cheers always, one of the things they were doing and was what's known as write for radio. That means each character actually had unique dialogue, so you didn't actually have to watch, and you didn't even have to hear. You could read the dialogue, you know who said it. So they would write for radio, and it was a standalone, so you could tune into Cheers this week, and you see a standalone episode, and you could skip it for 3 months, and you could see another standalone episode. And it usually played on some sort of universal emotion, like embarrassment or amusement or whatever. So that was the rules of television. And that was Friends, that was Cheers, that was How I Met Your Mother, that was in the more contemporary time, The Big Bang Theory. It's became kind of a very formulaic way of doing television. Breaking the rules, that was Netflix. And so what's interesting about the Netflix story is a story about taking the old rules of television and making new rules. And one of the breakout series was House of Cards, or also Orange is the New Black, probably the first of Netflix doing its own content. And what Netflix did was essentially take the formula of old television and change the rules. So for example, the old formula of television was about having great writers. The new formula was still having great writers. Nobody wants to have bad writers, but it was about having great directors. And so directing actually became more focal than writing. And so the directors that Netflix used, for example, directors like David Fincher, who were Oscar nominated or even Oscar winning directors. And what Netflix did was have a director, David Fincher did the first about 5 or 6 episodes, and then other top directors would do 2 episodes. They did 20-day shoots, and they could hire some of their own people. So, but what they did was take A-level talent directors to give the Netflix productions a cinematic quality that regular television didn't have. The second thing that Netflix did was change the formula from standalone episodes to a serialized ongoing story where characters would come in and out of the story. So they sort of broke up that weekly format. The third thing they did, and perhaps one of the biggest, was on programming. Which, as I think we all know, and we're all now very familiar with from Games of Thrones or whatever else you're watching, of the binge watching. But when Netflix first did that was breakout. That was saying, we're going to bet on 2 years of a show that it's going to work. Historically, television had not done that. Television had done a pilot, and then we buy a couple episodes, and if we like it, we keep buying. This was completely different. This was buying 2 years of a show and hoping. So that really changed the rules of programming. But what Netflix was doing was taking advantage of the fact they had 30 million subscribers. And as the comment in the industry was, Netflix knew you would like House of Cards before you knew you would like House of Cards, because they could tell from their data the kind of actors that people who are on Netflix liked and the kind of programming they liked. And so they upended the rules of television with buying series in advance, which they could get a better price on, actors who they knew would be popular, and themes they knew would be popular with their audience. So to sum up, Netflix took the rules of an industry that had still, in fact, they're still being used, and changed those rules. Went from writing to directing as the focus, and then some rules about how they did that, who they were asking. Some rules about format, from 30-minute format to serialized. And finally, the big change of programming, of buying in bulk, buying for a long period of time, and then allowing people to binge watch if they wanted to. And so what happened is, I think you probably all know, is that's now become kind of a standard way of doing things, particularly on the cable, the non-network channels. And in their first year, actually, House of Cards won something like, they got 12 Golden Globes awards or nominations, won an Oscar, and so on. So that's, I think, where I'm going to end it and open it up for you all. But what I think, maybe I'll leave you with this little parting comment from Leonardo. The idea of all of these stories and examples is to emphasize that when you're in a chaotic world, which I think many of you who are executives are in, and many of you who are academics and consultants and working with companies know, that it's a chaotic world, and you need to step back, simplify, so that people can be flexible, can remember what to do, and can cooperate across groups. So with that, I'm going to open it up and let people ask questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So I'll moderate the Q&A during this process. And we've got a lot of great questions. First, I just wanted to thank you. You provided a lot of very thought-provoking insights for those of us researching issues related to organizational resilience and performance, for those of us who are thinking about our students and how do we prepare them as they finish up their business programs, and then for the executives out there who are running organizations or advising organizations, a lot of really great insights to think about. So in terms of some of the questions that have come in, there's a set that focus more on forming the rules in the first place. So Vikas raises a point about, are they the result of trial and error, mistakes and failures? Christopher asks a question about the role of cognition in developing these rules. Thomas has some great points about how important is deep contextual insights in terms of coming up with these rules in the first place. So can you talk a little bit about the formation of simple rules?
Yeah, I think there are a variety of ways that they're formed. So sometimes it's a combination of trial and error and experimentation. So for example, the simple rules of Airbnb that I mentioned to you, part of that was trial and error. For example, the initial idea was that Airbnb was going to appeal to 20-somethings and the best hosts were going to be apartments because you can get a whole lot of them at once. It was trial and error to realize that, in fact, that the Airbnb service is much more broadly appealing. And in fact, it's people over 55 more likely to use it than people under 25. So that was sort of trial and error. The photography, the example of photos that I told you about, and realizing the importance of photos was a trial and error. The founders of Airbnb went to New York, started staying at different Airbnb hosts, realizing that, wait a minute, these photos are terrible. And as you may remember, the founders of Airbnb went to Brown School of Design. So they were, aesthetically aware. And so they said, let's try these photos. And then they actually ran an A/B test of, okay, let's have some of our properties have professional photos and some just, everybody's iPhone. And so they stumbled onto it, which was trial and error, but then they honed it with experimentation. And in my experience, that's actually what a lot of companies do to find the rules, is they stumble on things and they also experiment. So that's one thing. In terms of failures, yeah, I worked with a biotech company where the key process, and you'll notice a lot of these rules are around key processes, on the alliance process. And what we did with this team was we got together on an offsite and we looked at a list of their partners and sort of said, well, which partners worked and which partners didn't, and who were we choosing anyway? And so what they realized and said, and when we said, okay, let's look at the list, and if you didn't know how we were picking partners, what rules would have been, what rules that looked like we were using? And when they came up with and said, wait a minute, it looks like we're choosing partners who are not as good as they used to be and who we can boss around. And as they said, well, you know, that's a really bad set of rules. And then they said, let's go in to see what really we want to have as our rules. So going back on your own experience is a way to also come up with the rules. Cognitive sometimes plays in terms of analogies. Maybe I'll use Netflix again, just because, you know, I haven't popped into my mind. But when Netflix first started their original business, which was the video by mail, a couple of the rules they used to start were actually imitations of Blockbuster. So some of the rules around return policy were imitations of Blockbuster. Just because they could use Blockbuster analogy, and then once they saw those rules, they improved them. So in fact, what we've often seen is people will start with rules. To give you one last example, I'm going to the next set of questions. But we were working with companies in Finland, Singapore, and States. And this was work with Chris Bingham. And what we realized that, and we're looking at companies that were trying to internationalize, and we realized that the first rules look a lot like Kahneman and Tversky biases. For example, all the Finns would say, oh, well, let's go to Sweden. Whether or not their product fit with Sweden, whether or not that was the best place for their product, they just said, well, we know Sweden, let's go to Sweden. And interestingly, all the Singaporeans said, oh, let's go to Malaysia, because we know Malaysia. And instead, what they started to realize is those are actually really bad rules. What does our product really do? And it's in fact a much better fit, let's say the UK, or it's a better fit with France, or these bigger economies that had more going on than, for example, the Nordics, which tend to be pretty small markets. So there's also this idea that the more astute people and executives have rules, but then they revisit those rules, and are those rules still working? And can we get smarter as we start to the question about deep context? As we start to get the context better, can we make those rules more precise and often more abstract? Okay, does that do it? I hope.
That's great. That's great. And then we've got another question that's maybe the next step in terms of thinking about these, from Andreas Koenig. Talks about, are there categorizations or taxonomies of simple rules? Are there different types? Are there characteristics of situations that make different kinds of simple rules preferable to others?
Okay, yeah, I didn't get into the categories because I wanted to leave plenty of time for everyone out there, or at least enough time. Yes, for sure, there are types of rules. We figured that out. It's very easy to learn rules about picking things, like picking partners. So we went on a particular kind of. I'll use the Google example. Where I told you Google had this rule of we look at GPA, we look at school, but we also look for eccentricity. So people are good at thinking about rules. They're also thinking about rules about how to do something, like let's take professional photos in the Airbnb case. What people are less good at is rules about time. So for example, I was working with one company that was forming alliances, and realized that and they had a new process. They were trying to form global alliances, that they could only do so many partners at once. And so they started putting some timing rules of, we're going to bring on a new partner every 3 months, and we're also going to stay with a partner for 3 months, but if they haven't gotten a sale, we're going to drop them. So they had both a timing rule of how many they were going to. So every 3 months we get a new partner, new partner, new partner, new partner. And then also a rule to get out of a partnership. Wait a minute, if they aren't selling for us after a certain amount of time, we'll also leave the partnership. So it's those timing and those stopping rules that actually, when we've looked empirically, are probably the bigger driver of performance. The rules that are harder for people to think about. And so when I'm, say, working with companies, we'll often do the picking and the how-to rules pretty quickly. And then I'll say, okay, let's now think about what would be a criteria for stopping doing this? What would be some timing rules? Another timing example is actually an interesting one. This is Pixar, the movie house, the movie studio. So of WALL-E and or Frozen. all those various shows. Well, their first one was Toy Story. Toy Story took 4 years to make, and you can't really run a business with a movie every 4 years. And so what they started to do was actually have timing rules, and the main timing rule was 1 movie a year released at Thanksgiving here in the States. The prelude to the holiday season, which is the big movie going season for families. But 1 movie a year, having that rhythm then backed into a bunch of other rhythms you had to have to choreograph that. So different parts of Pixar know every year we do a movie, and then they say, well, in the first year I have to do this, the second year, the third year, the fourth year. So it became a set of, if you will, a movie making factory around time rules. So those. Okay, should I go to the next one?
Yeah. So another question is, can you talk about specifically how the focus on simple rules relates to a firm's core resources and competencies? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. And that is, if you go to the example that I said about Netflix. Netflix was able to change the rules of programming and in some sense make TV more movie-like, in part because they knew the movie business. That was what their movie, DVD by mail was essentially. So they had movie industry connections, and even more important, they had 30 million subscribers. And so they knew what those 30 million subscribers. They were effectively leveraging a resource that the traditional television studios didn't have. Traditional television studios had nowhere near the insight into their customers. So that certainly is certainly resources. One thinks about one's resources and how can what one might uniquely know, and then some rules off that for sure.
Great. And then another very interesting question from Angel about the fact that your work tends to focus on entrepreneurial firms. Can you comment a little bit on applying simple rules in a larger firm or older firms, and how that compares and contrasts to smaller, more entrepreneurial firms?
Okay, yeah, you're right. I do my research mostly in small firms because they have amazing transparency, but it's consulting to big companies that pays the bills. So it's like two different worlds there. The difference, one of the big differences from the young companies to the more mature is the Nikes, the Fords, the SAPs, whatever, is that there you're taking away rules, you're not adding rules. So entrepreneurial companies, the game is get to good rules quickly so you can scale. In big firms, it's cut away all those rules we don't want. And so in bigger companies, the challenge is more taking a whole rule book and cutting it down. I was talking to some people recently who were running a set of a string of retirement communities, and they had this sort of giant rule book for how do you run a retirement community, and they were now on multi-sites, and it was just people basically, when you have a rule book that big, people just do what they want because it's too many rules. It's kind of like if your tax code's too big, everybody cheats because they just don't get it. So what they did was they had a campfire, and they threw the rule books into the campfire and just like watched it burn. Like, here's the rule books burning. And then said, okay, we're gonna have no rules for a month. And then we're gonna meet back and we're gonna say, okay, what rules did we really need? And so they went back, and that's how they simplified their rules. So that's probably the big difference, is you're cutting back, not adding. The other big difference that big company managers don't understand is that you have to keep managing the rules. It's kind of like having rules for your teenager. It's always dynamic. And so big companies tend to make a change and they don't do anything. You actually have to keep managing. So those are the two differences, cutting back and managing the number.
We have a number of very interesting questions about applying simple rules to academia. So to conducting research or to being successful in an academic career. Can you share your insights on that with us?
Yeah, I can. Actually, this is a rule that I learned really junior in my career from my colleague, Bob Sutton. I guess in the academic world, many of you know Bob. And his rule was 3 papers makes a stream. And so he said, and I said, what does that mean? That means don't stop writing about a topic until you've written 3 papers about it. Because then you will get some efficiencies on that 3rd paper because you've written about it already. So you already know how to do the methods in the intro and stuff. And you will also get more of a name for yourself, because that's enough papers that people see a pattern and they recognize you. So in my own career, I started out, my dissertation was in agency theory. I really didn't like agency theory. It's like not my style, but I made myself write 3 papers, and the 3rd paper was the biggest paper, you know, of the 3. So that was probably the one big role that I have in academics. I don't so much follow it anymore because I just do what I want to do. But certainly when I was trying to be successful, that was the big role for me. 3 papers makes a stream.
That's great. We have an interesting question about cultural context. Is there anything culturally specific about the concept of simple rules? Adrian asks, I've been told that Japanese and Korean customers actually mistrust simplicity and prefer complex and detailed manuals. You know, can you talk a little bit about anything that you've uncovered in your work about cultural differences to using this kind of approach?
Well, certainly there are cultural differences. And I think I mentioned before, for example, the company that Chris and I were working with, where they had the simple rule of always do business in Commonwealth countries, and that was basically, it's not that Nigeria is the same as New Zealand, or India is the same as New Zealand, but there are certain British Empire vestiges that are essentially homogenizing the culture. But yeah, you do have to have different rules for different cultures. For example, I'm more familiar with China than I am with Japan and Korea. But in China, you can have more top-down rules. In fact, people expect more top-down rules. So rules that have the boss doing whatever. So more rules that are top-down. So for sure, I think you'd have cultural context. Sometimes if you're a multinational company, you can have rules that fit in any context. So for example, some of those Airbnb rules fit in a variety of contexts. But for other companies, the rules can be more culturally specific, or they are broad. For example, this is another company I worked with where they were doing it was international travel, and it was a marketplace connecting hosts in local countries where you could have a meal at their house. So you go to Thailand, you could be at somebody's house having a meal, and you're a Western or European or whatever traveler. And they had some rules about those host interactions, but then there was a lot that was culturally specific about what was actually going on that people went with. So I'd say yes. I guess that was a long way of saying sometimes the rules actually fit across. Sometimes you have to make them unique to the culture, and sometimes you take advantage of the culture. So, for example, in Asia, knowing that Taiwan is actually fairly conservative, but Korea likes leading edge tech, you usually bring cutting edge products to Korea first, and then you go to Taiwan later.
Yeah. And a lot of other interesting comments about context in particular. Toria asks about, is there a difference in applying simple rules to predictable versus more unpredictable circumstances? So can you comment maybe on the rate of change in the environment that a firm might be operating in and how that might influence the effectiveness of using a simple rules approach?
Right. If you're in a really stable market, you may just want to go on into routines. So just routinize the whole thing. So for example, you don't see McDonald's doing simple rules. I mean, McDonald's is a serious routinized playbook. So anytime it's very stable, or when there's actual safety issues. So for example, airplane checklists are not simple rules. It's actually a checklist. Surgery is a checklist. So when there's safety issues or when it's very stable, you have lots of rules and it's not simple anymore. So simple rules make more sense when you're talking about growth markets, when things are changing. Then you want to be able to be flexible. There's a lot going on. You only want to do a few things. So the simple rules are primarily new and growth markets.
Great. And Rajan asks a related question. Simple rules, as you described, seem to be behind the emergence of dominant design and innovations. Any thoughts on the relationship between simple rules and the evolution of dominant designs?
Yeah, I think dominant design is more of a one-off. That's more like they're not simple rules for getting married, so they're not simple rules for dominant design. In fact, I have, for those of you who are academics, I have a paper that's going to be coming out with Rob Bremner in Org Science soon, where we're comparing DJI, the Chinese drone manufacturer, with 3DR, which was a an innovation, online community-based innovation. And the community was much better than DJI at figuring out the quad rotor dominant design, because you had broad exploration of thousands of people as opposed to 10 guys in a place in Shenzhen. So the dominant design is more of a one-off. It's what you do with the dominant design that then becomes simple rules. So then DJI much more effectively leveraged the quad rotor design to product after product after product.
And one question, obviously we're all dealing with COVID in the higher ed environment. Can you comment a little bit on whether you've seen any universities do a particularly better job than others that have more of a simple approach as opposed to a more complicated approach?
Oh gosh, I only know Stanford, and I don't know, but I do know I was talking with a company in the UK, and they were telling me about what their COVID approach was, and which I thought was pretty clever. They said, okay, we're all in lockdown. How do we make this work? And so the executive team said, what we want to do is come out of COVID with our employees happy and better, and even better motivated than they were before. So what are we going to do? So what they did was they said, first of all, safety first. So we're going to follow the safety guidelines that the UK says we should follow. Second, we're going to provide PPE to our employees and to their families. And third, we're going to every so often have online fun, and we buy free food. And they had a sort of a schedule that they were doing that. So they had this sort of thoughtful way of how can we come out of COVID safe, but also kind of still together, and kind of we're in this together and doing something fun like free food. I think, so I can't really compare across campuses. Frankly, I find Stanford onerous. I mean, I can't, I have to have a COVID check to go to Stanford, and, anyway, hope that does it though. But I think certainly there's some businesses that have thought about how to take advantage of adversity, I think are doing better.
Yeah. And then I know we're running short on time. One last question before we wrap up. Can you comment a little bit on the intersections of complexity theory with what you're talking about in terms of simple rules?
Oh yeah, of course. I think the connection with complexity theory is huge. I mean, I didn't talk about it, given this was sort of a mixed audience. I didn't talk about complexity theory at all. But this is very much complexity theory. The idea of a partial, a small number of simple rules. For those of you in the academic world, I have an ASQ article in, I think, 2009 with Jason Davis and Chris Bingham, where we do computer simulations of simple rules. But yes, very, very, very close to complexity theory, and the idea that you're balancing an edge of chaos between efficiency and flexibility.
Thank you. This has been really helpful in terms of sharing your insights so that both our academic audiences who are thinking about how this might inform their research or how it informs how they're preparing students can learn from this. And then I know from those of us who are on the call who are working in organizations to drive performance and drive good decision-making, some of these insights have been incredibly helpful. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, as Will mentioned at the top of the call, these strategy imagination forums are an effort by SMS to make sure we're engaging thoughtfully between our academics as well as our executives who are members of SMS, and using this to inform both impactful research and impactful practice as well.